doesn't bother me at all. This is, it's a minor expense to put this on, in Roselle and give us some experience in getting the donut holes on.
And I think I would preface, I think in my position at least, and I won't speak for the board, but I think there's a difference between a vacant parcel that we're trying to village initiate annexation on versus one that has a resident on it that may not want to be in the village. So I think in this case, it's a slightly different circumstance, but
Yeah, slightly.
Is this actually two parcels with the parcels? I'm sorry, with that line down the middle? Or is it all?
Yeah, it's 2 pin numbers. Or pins.
any other discussion or thoughts from the board? Trustee Trejo?
Just for clarity, so right now, the county maintains all zoning jurisdiction over that property.
Over this property, correct.
Yeah, I'm good with moving forward.
Consensus move forward. I'm seeing a lot of head nodding.
Yep.
All right, everyone's in concurrence. So we'll initiate that process and we'll see where this goes. So thank you so much. All right, we'll move on to our next item on the agenda. We have a presentation and update on the ongoing investing in infrastructure, community engagement initiatives, and provide direction on revenue enhancement options. So Village Administrator Belowski, whenever you're ready. And it is page 320 in the packet.
And when power comes back on, there's always, are those accessible? Maybe just reset them.
We'll try to get them on the screen, but while we
So you
go,
can tell we're maybe not 100% online with at least our HVAC, I think, in this.
he said it was getting a little steamy. It wasn't too bad.
It's a
Thank
little
you.
quiet in here.
70
Usually you hear
degrees.
some airflow. But you said comments on site, Karen, Young? Yeah, so all of our buildings are back. Most of the community is restored. While Brian looks to update or get those back online. So this agenda item is just a continuing conversation that we've been having with the community and the board around the infrastructure funding. Kind of looking backwards, we had some forums March and May. With that were presentations that were provided. In the board's packet tonight is a preview of the July forum presentation. For those of you who have attended some of the forums, you kind of know we started very broad, very just educational as far as what infrastructure is to the community, what it means, the funding sources that are dedicated to it. And kind of the next forum is going to start to hopefully hone in on a little more of what are the solutions that the board wants to pursue in order to obtain the necessary funds to make the infrastructure improvements. And leaving tonight, my hope is that the board provides a little direction, a little refinement on what it is interested in and is not interested in. And that way we can move forward with some of these forums to communicate to the community as far as kind of that initial direction provided by the board. So Brian, do we think it can? So with that, I'll stop and just see if there's any questions generally about the forums, the upcoming. You see the various additional public meetings, the restoration of Coffee with the Board every other month to kind of continue to drive home to the community, the messaging around the infrastructure and what is needed. We're kind of getting into the presentation.
Any questions from the board? All right. That's fine. Just let us know what slide you're on and we'll follow along on our devices.
So I'll just start at slide, 1, but just kind of going through here really at slide 3 and 4 are just explaining where existing revenues go from a property tax perspective. And then, that none of that goes towards capital and what really the dedicated funding mechanisms are for the different capital improvement budgets, really utility taxes and particularly the capital improvement surcharge is the big one dedicated to all water and sewer infrastructure improvements, and then motor fuel tax for roads. Moving on to slide 6, kind of shows that delta between what we currently need in revenue and what we currently are collecting in revenue just to tackle the water and sewer system improvements, which is that $80 million number most of you have probably heard me talk about before, and that the delta is $4.5 million in our annually, and our existing revenue is $3.5 million. So there's a substantial amount of revenue necessary in order to invest into these projects that, for the most part, are IEPA regulated improvements that must be done by a certain state mandated deadline. Next big on page or slide 11 is the stormwater, and again, focusing and on the 3 basins and the studies that have either been completed in the Devlin and Seasons 4, and the other Central Meacham is near completion, which will identify even additional money that needs to be spent within that watershed, and that $30 million kind of cost estimate for improvements necessary across the community, just from within those basins. And there's certainly other stormwater improvements that would be necessary, but those are really the big ones that these studies are responsible for. Then you kind of have your smaller, neighborhood improvements as well. Moving on to slide 8 is the streets and sidewalks, and continuing to show the level of funding we currently put towards streets and the level of funding I think the policy objective is to improve our quality of roads and not to continue to regress at our overall pavement condition rating. Moving ahead, really, so our next kind of focus with this, starting on slide 11, is to start to address some of the questions that community members have brought up at the forums, or we kind of generally hear from the community as far as finding that $6 million in annual additional revenue. So slide 11 is kind of to bring some reality to what $4 million in sales tax is, and looking at, the equivalent of 11 Walmarts in Roselle. So I think it's certainly not achievable, but just kind of think provides some context to the amount of revenue that is needed to solve our infrastructure investment needs. Along the same on slide 12 is, can we cut our way out of this and reallocate existing general fund revenue towards capital projects by cutting $4 million annually and reinvesting that or reallocating that. And this slide here shows where that would come from, and it would come directly from service and providing services to the community. If you were to cut 20% of the general fund to get to that $4 million number, you'd be looking at personnel and contractual services that provide services to the community, which I don't think is something that, at least we've heard the community ask for, a reduction in services. Also, the population number is 25,000 residents is what is the limit for home rule status. If you have that population, you automatically become home rule. And kind of the number necessary to get to 25 residents is equal to roughly 6 Metro 19s. And I think slide 14 is really the reason why we have the 3 preceding slides, which is what is the right mix between density, taxes, and public service level. We can't necessarily, that area in the middle is kind of that what we list as unattainable. So something has to give, I think, overall service delivery model. If you want less public services, then you take the service cuts, and you want lower taxes, then you're going to take some of the pros and cons to the different approaches here. We've not heard the community say they want super high density. We've not heard people say we want to cut services. So this is kind of that diagram I feel represents kind of the challenge that is facing the board right now, is finding that right mix and working with the community to find that right mix to meet the needs without giving up much of what I think makes Roselle unique and its community feeling and fabric. So moving forward now and starting on slide 15, are really the options starting on slide 17 available to the board currently. We've previewed these with the community in our forums. The first option is really those things the board can do just today through action and at a village board meeting. It doesn't require voter approval, which is significantly increasing the CIS charges on the water and sewer bills to obtain that $4.5 million. That would be nearly tripling of that fee. So that's a significant increasing the electric tax, increasing vehicle stickers, and also imposing another tax, a utility tax that's a municipal utility tax that's available under state law and can be implemented via ordinance. So that's really, that option is the most on the shoulders of our residents, of the consumers of these various services, water, sewer, and other. Option 2 gets now into kind of sharing that cost increase across visitors, shoppers in the community, outside residents. And that's that non-home rule sales tax that does in fact require a referendum be passed. Kind of highlighting the highlights of this is at a 1% sales tax rate, which is the maximum that would be allowed under state law, is roughly $3.5 million, which falls short of that $4 million kind of target. And here is kind of outline the pros and cons of this approach. Certainly it shifts most of the burden away from the capital improvement surcharge, but still has some there, and on to the purchase of goods in the community by residents and non-residents as well. It also doesn't provide anything more than the revenue necessary to tackle the water sewer infrastructure improvements. So it doesn't really get to the streets and the sidewalks and the stormwater needs that the community has. There's some charts here that kind of show if the sales tax were approved, kind of what the effect of that would be on the CIS rates. And option 3 then is the home rule, which would provide the village much more flexibility than any of the other options currently available to us as a non-home rule municipality. As that one slide showed, I don't think this village will get there through population growth that's counted every decade. So the slide 21 highlights really the significant or the key differences between home rule and non-home rule. Again, having the more, the broader flexibility that the village would have under a home rule status. It kind of more creatively solve the problems and issues facing the community than we currently have under state law. Outlined on slide 22 are some of those kind of additional revenue opportunities that would be available to the village if they were home rule. You could impose a home rule sales tax that is not capped at the 1% maximum currently. You could impose a local gasoline tax. You would be able to expand the applicability of the natural use gas tax. And you could, consider other utilization of the taxing powers that are afforded a home rule municipality. Also from a regulatory and policy possibility under state law, the village would have more flexibility to solve its local issues, really to take more of a licensing approach to many things versus right now it's a registration approach. So under a lot of things we do, you register as a contractor in town, you're not licensed. Short-term rentals is a registry, you're not licensed. Businesses are registered, not licensed. And under having licensing power, you have much more control and ability to address issues that come up at a business level because you have the ability to take away a license and potentially close a business after being afforded kind of due process, but it definitely gives the village more control and powers at the local level. Moving on to slide 23 is a slide that we've used before in our forums that compare other near adjoining communities and whether or not they're home rule, and then what taxes they have imposed either through referendum or in this case, all communities, but Itasca are home rule and all those communities do have some tax imposed under their home rule authority. So kind of moving through slides 24 and 25 is kind of finding a balance from staff's perspective to meet that goal of increased revenue for all of the infrastructure needs, not just water and sewer. And those are what those scenarios that are presented to the board here is, depending on, in these two scenarios, it's a local gasoline tax as well as a local sales tax being imposed that finds the village obtaining more revenue under those scenarios to put towards a broader base of capital infrastructure improvements that are necessary. Moving on to kind of slide 27, 28 are really highlighting some of the differences between the solutions available and options available to the board between using just increasing all user fees compared to the non-home rule sales tax compared to home rule status, and kind of showing the comparisons there. So really here tonight then is direction from the board primarily related to those options. Are there certain ones you're interested in, not interested in? Kind of the questions I outlined in my memo to kind of start to hone in on refining possibly this presentation, the one for July, but also as we start to work towards July, knowing in the back of our minds what the board is interested in doing, if you need to have to come back with more information, more data. And ultimately, my desire is that the board have something approved by November 1st before we go into the budget. There are some statutory deadlines that have to be met if you do place stuff on the upcoming ballots. So want to make sure, we know the options you want to go, the direction, and then we can come back to with more definitive deadlines and maybe some other additional information.
So I know it's a lot of information to digest, but I think we're at that critical moment where we're ready to continue to educate the public, but we need to be more directive in terms of what we would potentially be looking to pursue. And I think we need to start to narrow that window, as Jason said. So I know there's a number of questions and we may not have all those answers tonight, and that's okay, but I think we need to start to provide direction. So when we have further forums, we're able to start to speak with more the board is considering, instead of these are hypothetical scenarios, if that makes sense. So I think it's very important we're all comfortable with what we're willing to float out there. So with that being the case, let's look at option one first. There's a number of bullets that Jason has in his memo. I know these are all things we probably would not want to do, but out of the consideration of increasing the water and sewer capital improvement surcharge, increasing the electric tax, increasing vehicle stickers, and creating a municipal utility tax, is there any opinions on those? Like, should we not have other funding authorities? What's the temperature on those?
I think that's just a temporary Band-Aid for us. It covers the one problem, but it doesn't touch the other ones at all.
Anything that you feel is not worth considering, or do you think all those should be on the table? Should we find ourselves in that position?
Oh, I would think that, we've done a good job educating the people so far and we'll continue to do more, but I would think that we should let them decide. And that probably means the home rule status on the ballot is going to be the way I would lean.
Okay, so you have no objection to all those options. Okay. Trustee Chair, you had your hand up, sorry.
I mean, I was just gonna say, I don't think you could necessarily exclude anything. I think.
Okay.
I mean, if we're gonna do a home, I mean, I'm fine with going for referendum on a home rule and a non-home rule sales tax. I don't think you really know what you could exclude until you get those results. I mean,
That's fair.
at the end of the day, we may have to do, I mean, we're limited if the vote is no on home rule. So I think
100%.
I think citizens need to understand, the different levers that we have available. And just like the marijuana referendum, I mean, I'm totally fine with asking for home rule on the referendum and then the non-home rule sales tax, give them two options. And then to me, that makes sense.
On that note, and we'll come back to just circling around on the option one. I'd like to ask council, and we might not have an answer on this today, but is that something that we could do, or does one supersede the other in a way that we would get in trouble if we ask both questions on the ballot at the same time?
That's something we're actually looking at for you.
Okay.
I think Winfield I thought they just did that.
We'll continue to look into that. So as far as Cheryl is looking at the option one, you are in concurrence with everyone else?
Yeah, that was gonna
Okay.
be my question too. Is it acceptable to put both items on the same?
Dina, Tom, and Wayne, fine with all the options outlined on one being available?
No, David, if I may say, like, I'm pretty much in the home rule because I know that all these other towns around us have it, except Itasca. So they must have done a non-home rule referendum to get more sales tax, right?
Correct.
So I know some of the studies that we've done for home rule 5 years ago when the village was thinking about it. It's an unbelievable number, but let's say it's something like a couple hundred villages have gone into home rule and you can rescind it by vote. And only like 7 of them have taken it off. So home rule isn't the boogeyman that you think it is. It's something that when it's put in place, the elected officials have to do what they say they're gonna do with it, and you can always vote the elected officials out if they don't like the way the home rule's going. So I would go for the home rule.
Okay.
But to your point, I know what Roselle is. They'll wanna compromise or something. And so the non-home rule, if we could just bump the sales tax.
So that's a great way. I'm gonna pivot to next. So if we were to go with option 2, is everyone comfortable continuing to communicate forward with the full 1% that's allowable for a non-home rule sales tax? Is that everyone's consensus on that one? Okay, so we got direction on that. So then the big,
That's a good question.
yeah, absolutely.
So if it fails, what have we lost? We've lost time. And then if we have to resort to the first one, I mean, it's almost like.
Well, and I think
Scenario.
we'll get direction from council whether we have to prioritize one question over the other, but I think we at least all sorts of different strategies at play. So
Okay.
as far as the home rule goes, and obviously that home rule is just a question of do you or do you not give the authority? So how we would implement that could vary and change, but there's a couple of things I think would help us narrow down and educate the public. We have 3 different scenarios in our packet. When we look at sales tax, we can implement that if we had home rule authority in 0.25% increments with no cap. Staff has outlined both using 1.25 as well as 1.5%. Is there any feeling from the board one way or another, or would you prefer to keep both of those options open? And again, I don't think any of this is a commitment, but I think again, from a communication standpoint, I think the goal is to try to narrow things down so the public has more information available to them. So. Trustee Chair is giving me a look like he wants to.
I mean, I think.
Let's put
this
you on the
is-
spot.
I think this is putting the cart before the horse. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the communication just should be, we're trying to reduce the burden as much as possible on our residents. I mean, there's so many different moving parts here where, like, if the referendum fails, then this has to do, you know, the CIS has to go up, it has to skyrocket. And I think, like, to me, I think it's just educating the public on the pros and potential cons of home rule and how you rectify those cons, and just kind of show, like, you know, the communication is we're trying to limit the burden on the residents as much as possible, because I think that's what everyone, you know, is looking to do.
Okay.
The
Is
bills will have to be paid.
that the consensus of the board as far as that? I don't think we could word it as a rate not to exceed. We don't believe we need to implement a rate that would exceed 1.5. That could be another way that we could communicate that as well. Is that
I mean, but and I'm just
your
saying,
point?
it's just like one of those things where it's like, it's hard to understand, like, okay, how much gas is being purchased from people outside of Roselle? So does it even make sense to go even higher on the gas tax? You know what I mean? Where it lessens the burden. So I think it's just a lot of unanswered questions in terms of like how we would actually implement.
But you had no problem with the way we diagrammed those out in the mock-up presentation.
No, yeah, I think it's good just to show example scenarios and things like that. But I think, like, in terms of a commitment, in terms of like, we won't go above X or Y. I think the commitment is that obviously we're all elected here. We're all residents of Roselle. We don't want to pay the taxes either if we don't need to, but like, we're trying to keep the burden as low as possible, and also trying to bring that burden, have the burden shouldered by people outside of the village, by developing things in the village to attract people to come to visit Roselle and spend the money in Roselle that we could reap the benefit of.
So on that note, if we feel the same way on the rates, there are other regulatory or policy decisions that we could say that we're interested in doing. So we discussed licensing versus registration, which would allow us to be able to implement or enforce things in a different level. Vehicle stickers, which is the bane of people's existence, or so I've been told. That's a revenue vehicle that we use because we lack other options. That's something that we could say we're interested in phasing out. Crime-free housing laws or something, or ordinances rather, that a lot of communities with home rule implement, that it requires background checks and other implementations for rental properties. Are there any policies from that side that the board would feel comfortable or would like to socialize as a part of this? Trustee Prokowski?
I would be fully in support of that because I think that's important for the education of what home rule is. Because, trustee Domke kind of alluded to this. There is a certain boogeyman that comes with home rule. There's that fear that it's just a tool to raise taxes, but we need to find ways to communicate. It's not just a rule, it's not to raise taxes, it's to tax more efficiently, but then also implement policies more efficiently, kind of have more say in what we can do as a municipal government. So I think if you focus on those sort of things as part of this package, it's an overall way to help educate the public on what home rule is and make, hopefully people will realize that there's more pros than there are cons if we move in this direction.
Is that the consensus of the board on those, all the above then on those three policy decisions or things that you guys think we should emphasize more? Trustee Trejo?
Yeah, I mean, I think like trustee Perkowski said, I mean, we have to just educate the public in what all this means and some of the things that we could leverage and some of the things that other towns have used home rule for. Even speak to, why Itasca and Bloomingdale, for example, got home rule. There's other reasons.
Not Itasca, but they have a non-home rule sales tax in Itasca. They're not home.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. But like Bloomingdale, for example, reasons why that happened. But I think we should speak to all of these, what are the pros of home rule outside of, like trustee Domke and Perkowski said, the boogeyman of the tax man. It's, we're not really looking for this to raise revenue per se for just revenue sake, right? We're doing it to meet IEPA mandates that are placed on us. And again, shouldering, making the burden less on our residents, I think is the critical thing.
Trustee Domke?
Springfield doesn't want to change the rule from 25,000 to 20,000. That should tell you something about what home rule is. Springfield doesn't want to give the villages the power to run themselves.
It would require a constitutional amendment, but nonetheless, they have not passed.
They don't have
to Be
that.
placed on a ballot, correct. But there are things they can do down there to give non-home rule more authority, and they choose not to do
They
that.
choose not to. So that tells you why home rule is a cool thing.
So reading the dice, there's no objection then to highlighting these three policy objectives that could potentially be implemented. The final question then is there anything that we would be comfortable saying that, the board is open to or would openly self-impose limitations on itself? I know property tax increases is sometimes something that people frequently discuss. Other communities have addressed that by saying they would abide by the PTEL limit restrictions that non-home rule communities are abide by. We could also decide that new or certain revenue votes would require a 2/3 majority versus just a simple majority. These are all things that we could obviously elect to do to ourselves. Those could also be suspended by ourselves as well. But is there any interest in exploring those, or do we think that that's not necessary as part of the conversation? Trustee Domke?
When you start talking to the residents, that may be brought up, and that would be something that we could offer to try to prove that we're not out to grab anybody's money. And like Lee said, it's our own pockets we're worried about too. So we have a vested interest in doing the right thing.
Trustee Perkowski?
I also think that would probably not be the worst idea, but that could also be part of the education because it highlights the restrictions that we're already under. So like the one that I always think of when I talk to people, I usually bring up is the hotel tax. By not being home rule, that money has to be spent on promoting tourism. We can't necessarily utilize that as efficiently. So we can talk about, yes, we'll impose these restrictions, but we're also going to be removing some restrictions that are somewhat burdensome on what we're trying to accomplish.
Other comments on that one? Trustee Trejo?
My only comment on the property tax, because like you just said, I mean, we could self-impose these limits and then another board could overrule those self-imposed limitations. My only question is whether or not that could actually be part of the home rule referendum question and basically impose those by referendum or not. Because I would like to have that.
I'm going to assume council doesn't have an answer to that right off the way, but we can do research, right?
Yeah.
If I shake the magic 8 ball, it says unlikely, but we'll look into it.
I agree, unlikely, but I think it'd be good to know the answer to that. And that way,
Absolutely.
at least we could communicate to residents, say, hey, our intention is we don't want to go beyond the PTEL rates. We looked into actually including it in the language so you guys could force it on us, but we just can't under Illinois law.
Okay. That's a fair strategy. So. Cheryl, Tom, agree?
agree, but I just don't want to make promises we
Can't.
can't keep.
That's fair. Absolutely. Well, and I think if you look at history at least, and this isn't to say that every community is different and the dynamics and what their needs are and what their expenses are very vastly different. A lot of communities that tote having no property tax increases, staying flat, usually have home rule authority to raise revenue in other sources. Granted, we do not have the commercial sectors that they do and stuff like that, but if there's prior experience in our region, that at least bodes as a trend, we'll say, so. But as we just heard today, a great day to have an actuarial report. We've got some liabilities to fund though too, so. So any other inputs or thoughts from the board overall on the strategy for our next two public forums? All right, any questions from staff or do we have enough direction to carry through and execute?
Very good. Thank you.
Well, we hope to have you all there July 18th. We'll also have as we have been doing an encore presentation 2 months later at a date to be determined. And like was mentioned earlier, we'll be bringing back coffees with the board starting in August on appropriately the Saturday of the Taste of Roselle. So we'll be doing that for the rest of this year at least. I would like everyone's feedback at the end of the year just to see how we feel about that. But I think as we're having these important conversations, having many different touch points at varying times of the day and the week is going to be super important. So that way residents can ask any questions they may have of us as we start to wait out there and ask them for them to weigh in on these decisions. So. All right, we do have a second opportunity for village board public comment. Is there any member of the public here tonight that wishes to make a comment at this time? Let the record show none. Could I have a motion to convene executive session for the purposes to discuss personnel performance review and property acquisition?
So moved.
Again,
Could we have a roll call, please?
Trustee Trejo.
Aye.
Trustee Domke.
Aye.
Trustee Delapenna.
Aye.
Trustee Forsythe.
Aye.
Trustee Lanisa.
Aye.
Trustee Prokowski.
Aye.
That motion carries, and we will be adjourning from executive session. No final action will be taken on these items.